I was 21 when this happened. It was late winter, right after my university's toughest semester had finally ended. My brain was completely fried. I was so burnt out that I didn't want to look at another textbook, stare at another screen, or hear another person's voice for at least a week. I just wanted to be completely alone to decompress. I went online and found a ridiculously cheap off-grid A-frame cabin deep in the Pacific Northwest woods. The owner warned me that it had no cell service and was at the end of a private, unplowed logging road, which was exactly the kind of isolation I was looking for. When I got there on a Thursday afternoon, the silence was exactly what I wanted. The cabin was basically one large room with a loft, and the entire front wall was made of glass. During the day, it was beautiful, but at night, sitting in a lit room surrounded by glass and pitch-black woods, you feel like you are living inside a fishbowl. I spent the first night just sitting at the small wooden dining table, drinking a beer by the light of a single lantern and enjoying the absolute quiet. Around 2 in the morning, I paused to stretch my neck. I looked out the massive front window into the dark tree line. Suddenly, a bright, harsh, white light flashed from deep in the woods. Just one flash. It illuminated the snow and the tree trunks for a split second before the darkness swallowed it back up. I didn't think much of it. I figured it was just heat lightning or maybe just my exhausted eyes playing tricks on me. The next morning, I threw on my boots and hiked out into the snow just to clear my head. When I reached the tree line where I had seen the flash, I found an old camouflage trail camera strapped to a pine tree. The lens was pointed directly at the cabin's living room window. I told myself it was just a motion sensor camera left behind by a hunter to track deer or something. I didn't want to let my paranoia ruin a perfectly good trip, so I left it there and walked back inside. Night 2 is when things changed. The wind had died down completely, leaving the forest in that dead, heavy silence you only get after a fresh snowfall. I was at the table again around 1 in the morning. I heard a heavy, rhythmic thud against the exterior side wall of the cabin. It didn't sound like an animal brushing past. It sounded like a full-grown person slowly leaning their entire body weight against the wood, stepping back, and doing it again. I froze for some time. Then I slowly reached over and clicked off my lantern, plunging the cabin into darkness. I snuck toward the edge of the glass wall and peered out into the snow. Standing just on the very edge of the porch light's reach was a tall man. He was wearing a dark, oversized jacket, but what made my stomach completely drop was his face. He was staring directly at the window, sporting a massive, unblinking, ear-to-ear smile. It wasn't a friendly smile, completely devoid of any human emotion. My voice was shaking, but I yelled through the glass that I had a gun and that he needed to leave. Instantly, his smile dropped into a flat, dead stare. He didn't run or step back. He slowly raised one long finger and pressed it against the glass. The exact second he tapped the front window, I heard an identical tap on the back window of the cabin. Then a tap on the side window, all perfectly in sync. I was completely surrounded in the middle of nowhere. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran into the tiny, windowless bathroom in the center of the cabin, slammed the door, and jammed a heavy wooden chair under the knob. I sat in the pitch black with a heavy metal fire poker in my hands, just listening to my own heartbeat. After about an hour, there was still no movement outside. I was so exhausted from the stress that I eventually passed out right there on the floor. When I finally woke up, I saw sunlight creeping under the door. When I finally unlocked the front door, the woods were completely silent. I walked around the outside of the cabin, but there was only one set of footprints in the snow, the ones belonging to the man in the front. I didn't know what to make of it. I clearly remembered hearing the tapping noises coming from all 3 sides of the cabin at the exact same time. Without wasting another second, I sprinted to the tree line, ripped the trail camera off the trunk, threw all my gear into my car, and drove straight to the nearest police station. I gave the SD card to the officer and told him there was a man standing right in front of the lens all night, and that he wasn't alone. An hour later, the officer pulled me into the back room to show me the footage. The camera's motion sensor had been triggered over 300 times during the night, firing off 300 consecutive flashes. The timestamps perfectly matched the exact hours the man was standing outside my window. But when we clicked through the photos, my blood ran completely cold. Every single photo was just empty woods. There was no tall man. There were no footprints in the snow, just 300 flashing images of an empty cabin in the dark. I still have no idea what was standing on my porch that night, but whatever it was, the camera couldn't see it. This happened a couple of years ago. I had just rented a cheap, run-down cabin deep in the Rocky Mountains. It was a 45-minute drive on a dirt road just to reach the nearest gas station. There was no cell phone service, no internet, and no neighbors for miles. It was just me, a heavy silence, and endless pine trees. I brought my German Shepherd Duke with me. The plan was to spend 3 weeks up there completely off the grid. The cabin needed a lot of work, and I wanted to spend my days painting, fixing loose floorboards, and just enjoying the total isolation. For the first few days, it was incredibly boring, but it was exactly what I wanted. I would wake up early, drink coffee on the porch, work on the house all day, and read a book at night. But on the 4th day, the vibe of the whole property changed. It started right as the sun went down. The sky was getting dark, so I opened the heavy wooden front door to let Duke out to the bathroom before we locked up for the night. Usually, the second I open the door, he runs down the steps and into the grass. But this time, he didn't. He walked out onto the porch and stopped dead in his tracks. His whole body went completely stiff. The hair on the back of his neck stood straight up. He lowered his head, locked his eyes on a dark patch of trees just past the edge of the yard, and let out a low, deep growl. It wasn't a playful sound. It was the kind of growl a dog makes when they feel genuinely threatened. I stepped out onto the porch and looked where he was staring, but it was just a wall of pitch-black trees. I couldn't see a single thing. I told him to go on, but he refused to move. He just stood there like a statue, staring into the dark. I eventually had to grab his collar and physically drag him backward into the house. I locked the door and told myself it was just a raccoon or maybe a coyote passing through. But the exact same thing happened the next evening. As soon as the sun went down, I opened the door and Duke froze on the porch again. He stared at the exact same spot in the tree line, growling into the dark. Again, I couldn't see anything. Again, I had to drag him inside by his collar. By the 6th night, my nerves were completely shot. I cracked the front door open to let him out, but this time, Duke didn't growl. He took one step outside, stopped, and let out a quiet whimper. He tucked his tail completely between his legs, turned around, and ran back into the living room, hiding behind my legs. I was about to pull the door shut when I heard it. It was a woman's voice saying, "Come here, Duke. Come on, boy." My blood ran completely cold. The most terrifying part was that it was my voice. Whatever was out there in the woods was perfectly copying the exact tone and words I used to call my dog, but it sounded flat. It had no emotion behind it at all. I reached over to the table by the door, grabbed my heavy flashlight, and shined the bright beam directly into the spot in the trees where Duke had been staring all week. Standing behind a thick pine tree was a shape. It was huge and shaped like a man, but it was just a solid, pitch-black mass. I couldn't see a face, I couldn't see clothes, and I couldn't see any details at all. It just swallowed the light. It was standing completely, unnaturally still, not even reacting to the blinding light. I slammed the heavy front door shut. I threw the deadbolt and latched the chain lock. I grabbed Duke by the collar, dragged him into the bedroom, and locked that door too. I grabbed a large kitchen knife, sat on the floor with my back against the wall, and turned off the bedroom light. 10 minutes later, the silence was broken. I heard slow, heavy footsteps walking up the wooden stairs of the front porch. They sounded heavy and dragging. The footsteps moved slowly across the porch. Then, they moved off the porch and around the side of the house. I heard the heavy thuds moving up the exterior wall of the cabin and then onto the roof. The wood groaned under the extreme weight. Whatever it was walked slowly across the roof, right over my bedroom. Then, the footsteps just stopped. There was no sound of jumping down, no sound of walking away. It was just complete, heavy silence again. I sat there on the floor, holding Duke as tight as I could. Suddenly, Duke's ears perked up. He turned his head away from the window and stared directly at the locked bedroom door. He started to shake. From the hallway, right on the other side of my bedroom door, I heard it again. That same imitation of my voice calling Duke. It was inside the house. I didn't wait to see if the doorknob would turn. I grabbed Duke, pushed open the bedroom window as fast as I could, and lifted him out into the cold yard. I climbed out right after him. We ran straight to my car. I locked the doors, and I drove down that dirt road as fast as the car would go. I still have no idea what was watching me from those trees all week, and I have absolutely no idea how it got inside my locked house without making a single sound. I had just gotten permission to hunt on a massive, privately owned piece of property that bordered a huge, completely undeveloped state park. There were thousands of acres of deep woods out there, and I was going to have it entirely to myself for the weekend. I arrived at the property line around 2 in the afternoon. My plan was to spend the rest of the daylight hours hiking deep into the woods to find the perfect spot, set up my camp for the night, and start the actual hunt right at dawn the next morning. I packed my heavy gear, locked my truck, and started the long hike into the trees. I spent hours walking through thick brush, tracking deer trails, and scouting the area. By the time I finally found a good clearing, the sun was already starting to go down, and the temperature was dropping fast. I quickly unpacked my zipper tent and set it up. It was basically a small, pop-up camouflage tent used for ground hunting. It has these tiny mesh windows that you can shoot through, but from the outside, it completely hides you. I threw my sleeping bag inside, ate a cold dinner, and pulled the heavy zipper shut. Once you are zipped inside one of those things at night, you are completely blind. It is just a dark little cube. I laid down in my sleeping bag, kept my heavy steel hunting rifle right next to my chest, and went to sleep. I woke up around 3 in the morning. The cold was so intense that I could see my own breath in the dark. The woods outside were completely, totally silent. No wind, no bugs, nothing. I just laid there, trying to warm up and go back to sleep. That is when the silence broke. I heard heavy footsteps crunching slowly through the dead leaves. They sounded huge. Every time a foot hit the ground, I could hear heavy branches snapping under the weight. I immediately told myself it was just a massive buck, or maybe a black bear moving through the brush. I slowly unzipped the top of my sleeping bag and gripped my rifle, trying not to make a single sound. The heavy, crunching footsteps walked directly up to the back wall of my zipper tent and stopped. There was only a millimeter of thin nylon fabric separating my back from whatever was standing right outside. I could hear it breathing. It was this deep, heavy, rhythmic exhale that sounded completely unnatural. I didn't turn on my flashlight. I knew if I clicked a light on, the beam would hit the walls of the tent and instantly give away my exact position in the dark. I just laid there on the freezing ground, holding my breath, waiting for it to leave. But then, the thing slowly started walking again. It took heavy, dragging steps, encircling the outside of my tent. It was dragging something across the nylon fabric as it walked. It finished the circle and stopped right behind me again. I laid completely frozen. Suddenly, I heard the nylon fabric start to stretch. A massive, heavy weight was slowly leaning its body against the outside of the tent. The back wall started to bow inward. It pushed the fabric right against my jacket. It kept pushing harder and harder, slowly collapsing the tent down on top of me. I was pushed into the corner of the tent in the pitch black, watching the fabric stretch to its absolute limit, waiting for the material to rip. Then, with a violently loud crack, the thick fiberglass poles of the tent snapped. The entire zipper tent collapsed, bringing the heavy fabric down right on top of me. I was pinned flat against the freezing dirt, completely tangled in the dark nylon. I didn't scream or try to push the heavy tent off me and make a run for it. I knew that whatever was standing right on the other side of that thin fabric was massive, and if I tried to run blind through the woods, I wouldn't make it 20 feet. My only option was to play dead. I laid perfectly still in the dark, gripping my hunting rifle tightly against my chest. I heard the heavy footsteps step right up to where my head was pinned against the ground. The breathing was so loud I could feel the heat of it through the fabric. Then, through a massive tear in the broken nylon, I felt something reach inside. It didn't grab my jacket or try to touch my skin. It just wrapped around the solid metal barrel of my rifle. I didn't try to fight it. I didn't try to pull back. I just let my hands go completely open. The thing pulled the heavy gun right out of my hands and into the dark. I laid under that broken tent, completely paralyzed. After a few minutes, the heavy footsteps slowly turned around and walked away into the woods. I didn't move a single muscle for 4 straight hours. I laid trapped under the fabric until the sun was fully up and I could hear birds chirping. When I finally gathered the courage to cut my way out of the broken tent with my pocket knife, I stood up and looked around. The woods were completely empty. There were no footprints in the hard dirt, but lying on the ground about 10 feet away was my hunting rifle. The thick steel barrel of the gun wasn't just damaged, it was completely bent in half at a perfect 90-degree angle. Whatever was out there had bent solid, heavy-gauge steel like it was a cheap piece of plastic, just to show me how easily it could have broken me. I left the tent and the gun right there in the dirt, walked back to my truck, and I never went into the woods again.